In this final lesson, examining an introduction to the subject of metaphysics, what I want to do is talk about the history of metaphysics. Now, as a basic precursor and a warning to you who are studying these lessons, this is going to be an overview introduction to the history of metaphysics. The concept of a very detailed and in-depth analysis of the history of metaphysics is not one that we can essentially squeeze into a 10-minute short lesson on the subject. In fact, a history of metaphysics could potentially be a series of lessons in and of itself as part of a general history of philosophy set of lessons. If any of you is interested in us doing a history of metaphysics series of lessons, then let us know. We can actually think about doing that in the future. But for now, we're just going to be taking a very brief overview to the history of metaphysics, mainly talking about the relationship between metaphysics and physics, or more broadly, metaphysics and science and the scientific discipline, and the place of metaphysics in this particular conversation. So, we know from our first lesson on the topic that the word metaphysics, the etymology of the phrase itself, originates from the work of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle didn't himself coin the term metaphysics, but it was the name given to a collection of works which were written by Aristotle, a sum of total of 14 books, and they were classified under the following heading: ta, meta, ta, pusika, or physica. Now, at the end of the day, what this actually means in translation is essentially roughly translating to after physics, ta meta ta physica. Okay, and another way in which we can translate that is to essentially describe it as metaphysica, metaphysics. And so we get the phrase metaphysics as a result. And you could probably understand that given these books roughly discussing issues of what we would describe as metaphysics today, they're titled essentially the quote after physics or metaphysics or post physics. One may be getting the impression, therefore, that the study of metaphysics is somehow a study of a subject to which physics itself may be subordinate. And you might find some philosophers who share that view even to this day, that metaphysics is by far a superior subject compared that to the study of the physical world and to physics more generally. However, though, today most people would probably argue that is not the correct interpretation of what we actually mean when we talk about the idea that Aristotle essentially coined, which is this idea of post-physica or after physics. Nor does it necessarily suggest that one has to therefore study physics before turning on to metaphysics, suggesting some kind of temporal element to the study of each of these subjects. The idea being that as soon as you have mastered the subject of physics, you should then go on to look at the subject of metaphysics afterwards. So, it should also be noted that metaphysics, even though it is given the name meta, it has the sort of prefix that is meta, is not necessarily suggestive of the subject being a second-order inquiry into the subject of physics. There are definitely elements of metaphysics that share similarities in terms of content and subject matter to the study of physics. So, for example, in future lessons' time, we're going to be talking about the metaphysics of time and the philosophy of time. Now, time is a subject that is studied quite significantly in physics as well, when you do things like special and general relativity, and you talk about quantum theory, etc., etc. And so there are definitely crossovers there, but to suggest that you could then go from studying the philosophy of time and being able to understand the basic principles of general relativity as a result would be a little bit naive. I wouldn't advise anybody to go and do that. Equally, if you study general relativity, that doesn't mean automatically that you have a fundamental and foundational grasp of the philosophy of time. They are still, despite covering similar content and similar subject matter, i.e. this phenomenon that we describe as time, they are still nevertheless distinct inquiries. And so as a result of which, to suggest that metaphysics is somehow a second-order inquiry into the subject of physics would also be misleading. So with all that being said, what do we actually mean about what metaphysics is? Well, if we remember back to our previous lesson, and we look at the studies from our previous lesson, we noted that when we look at metaphysics, we're fundamentally concerned in the nature and the fundamental understanding of reality, which again is something that is an issue that also concerns itself in physics. If you were to ask a physicist what their job is, what the idea of physics fundamentally is, they would probably answer by saying something along the lines of, my job is uncovering the fundamental nature of reality. And I guess when you study things like string theory and you study things like quantum mechanics and special relativity and cosmology, you are probably looking into and trying to understand how reality is put together, how the world works, how the universe works. Some philosophers argue that the subject of metaphysics concerns itself with looking at the nature of reality beyond its mere appearance, and instead talk about the meaning of reality and looking beneath the curtain, if you will. But given the historical development of the disciplines, you can understand why there is a close interconnection between the idea of metaphysics and the ordinary subject of physics. Because from the perspective of the history of philosophy, especially early on when we talk about the ancient and medieval period of philosophy, we know that there was very little delineation made between the study of subjects of science and the study of philosophy. Ancient philosophers would contribute significantly to the discovery of scientific advances, and vice versa. You would find that there are a number of very accomplished scientists that have also made contributions to the subject of philosophy. Even as late as the early 20th century, do we see a gross interconnectedness between what are described as the natural sciences or the physical sciences and that of the philosophy and that of the philosophical world. People like, for example, Bertrand Russell, being a very famous philosopher, wrote Principia Mathematica, which is, of course, a very deeply logical and mathematical piece of work, to the extent at which it actually probably crosses into the realm of mathematics as well as the realm of philosophy. Equally, ancient philosophers have contributed to the discovery of various different scientific advancements. Individuals like Pythagoras contributing to a lot of work in relation to mathematics. In and around the 1600s, you start to see the growing distinction made between science and philosophy, but this is still not to suggest that philosophers were not also scientists at this time. People like famous philosopher René Descartes contributed to mathematics in a number of ways through the establishment of the Cartesian coordinate system, something that is studied in every mathematics class to this day. Equally, you have people such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who not only will we be referencing at multiple points in our studies in metaphysics, but also was one of the people who invented calculus, which is, of course, so instrumental to our study of physics and understanding a lot of the physical world. If we take ourselves to today, though, the common understanding is that metaphysics, while distinct from physics and two completely distinct subjects, serves its own useful purpose, given supposedly looking behind the curtain to see how things really are compared to how they merely appear to be. And so as a result of which, to suggest that metaphysics is useless in some way, or metaphysics is subject to a number of critiques, is something that has a lot of debate within philosophy. But to that extent, in order to understand this, it is useful to understand essentially what metaphysics inquires. And so that's what these introductory lessons have been trying to essentially digress onto individuals. We will get to looking at critiques of metaphysics in the future, because there are some seemingly valid critiques that you can levy against the subject of metaphysics. The extent to which metaphysics is even meaningful or verifiable is a question that we can ask in the future. But for now, we're going to start to get into the brass tacks of this subject, beginning first with the philosophy of ontology.